What does it mean when a movie says based on a true story? The phrase has been ubiquitous, especially in movies attempting to scare you out of your shoes. The idea is that horrifying things that happen on screen actually occurred, and by extension, might happen to you. Some media even forgets about the pretense of based on a true story, and goes full ghost hunters. Netflix is rife with true stories about ghostly apparitions, demonic presences, and other spooky content that supposedly happened to real people. While always a niche genre, what laid the groundwork for these stories to be commercially successful was a tiny little indie movie in 2007 that rocketed to stardom. Paranormal Activity was a phenomenon. Shot on a minuscule budget, the story follows a couple dealing with a possible haunting by a demonic entity. While the actual level of frights vary by how scared of closing doors and thumping sounds you are, the movie was a kind of new Blair Witch that removed the need for you to go into the woods to find the boogeyman. Instead, the boogeyman could come to you. The movie is shot almost 100% on a very convincing facsimile of home video, and spawned innumerable sequels and ripoffs that dominated horror until a few years ago. Movies like The Gallows, The Devil Inside, or The Chernobyl Diaries prove that just shooting a movie through found footage does not always mean massive success. Paranormal Activity worked because it was different, and once the novelty was gone, there was very little blood to be drawn from the stone. Though my God, they did try. The obsession with based on a true story remained, however, with the next big wave of horror smash hits ushered in by a little-known director who used to work on the Saw franchise. James Wan started his spooky haunted house movies with the pretty good Insidious in 2010. What was refreshing about Insidious was that it was unashamed of being big, bold, and more than a little dumb. The movie wasn't afraid to introduce kooky ideas like The Further, and just go all out on being a ride for folks looking for a bit of spooky fun. In 2010, the entire horror market was just drowning in garbage found footage movies, and Insidious, with its campy intro and ridiculous ghosts, felt fresh. Also, James Wan knows how to build a jump scare like very few people.
I want it.
Insidious' story is a bit weak in places, but is completely made up for by Wan, who cranks up tension all the way to 11 with ease, and delivers some pretty scary monsters to grace the screen. What also helped Insidious is that it wasn't screaming at you every minute that it was based on true events. Instead, being able to be experienced like walking through a haunted house at Halloween. You walk through, some ghouls spook you, then you go home, and you laugh about it. Insidious was a success, if not a smash hit, but it launched the career of Wan, who was picked up by Warner Brothers for their next spooky project. If Insidious was a breath of fresh air, The Conjuring was the kind of horror movie that refreshes the market every decade or so. Today, The Conjuring's influence is impossible to ignore in horror, where even experimental directors like Ari Aster or Jordan Peele are cribbing Wan's way of shooting an empty hallway. The Conjuring was a critical and financial hit, terrifying audiences across the country, and making the cheaper, found footage movies of the previous years look dated and obsolete. But with the widespread popularity, there were always a few naysayers who want to say The Conjuring isn't that scary, or it's overrated. And while I hear them, nope, this thing is spooky as hell, and hangs with you for a few days after watching. What does legitimately bother people about The Conjuring is the weird reverence that it held for Ed and Lorraine Warren. I remember in the advertising for the film how much a deal they made of the strange happenings on the set, or in conversations with Lorraine Warren that seemed a bit, well, far-fetched. The Room of Evil Objects, for example, was a real thing that seems really spooky when everyone Googled that Annabelle Raggedy Ann doll. That is, until you realize that next to the Annabelle doll was a supposedly possessed copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide. Heralded as one of the stories Ed and Lorraine came across that was too disturbing for their popular memoirs, The Conjuring drapes itself in a lot of the same clothes that cover the Paranormal Activity franchise in its advertising and framing, presenting itself as based on a true story. Even the trailer, the first few seconds, still make it look like it's almost a found footage movie. And the movie works in spite of the awkward framing, because Wan is just that good of a director, and the actors do a decent job at turning the Warrens into a discount Sam and Dean Winchester. What's remarkable about The Conjuring is how superfluous the based on a true story framing really is. You could completely remove all of the based on the Warren files nonsense from the whole thing, and it would still scare the pants off people. Based on a true story is an attempt to ground The Conjuring in some kind of reality. And it wasn't needed, because just saying that a haunting really happened is not enough. Instead, grounding a story requires much more than just a tagline at the opening credits. Part 1. Writing Reality. Hi, quick aside. So the nice bookshelf background that I usually use for these kind of talky parts of my video is currently commandeered into a 4th grade classroom, so I'm not really going to be able to use it for that, so you get this wonderful Book of Mormon poster in my kitchen. For posterity's sake, the reason is there's a pandemic, and the federal government decided not to stop it, so yeah. So now I teach from home and do tech support for 17 4th graders. Is what it is, I guess. But back to the video, I guess. So there's this old saying in writer advice that people constantly pass around as reasons they don't connect with a book, movie, story, whatever. The saying is simple. Show, don't tell. The crux of the idea is that if you want to communicate to your audience that a character has a dark past, you should show something bad happening to them, instead of just saying they had a dark past. For example, Batman. It works a lot better to start a Batman movie with the famous killing of Batman's parents. That might be why we've seen it at least 1,000 times. That works better than just saying sometime later in the story, going, "Oh, Batman, yeah, he beats up criminals because his parents died." One of these is a much more effective way to communicate why Bruce Wayne dresses up like a bat. The problem with the adage is that stories constantly communicate information to the audience by both showing and telling. In fact, some of the best writing is a combination of showing and telling, or sometimes literally just looking into the camera and telling the audience information. For a good example of this, take a look at the Joker's monologues from The Dark Knight. He's consistently just kind of looking at you as an audience member and going, "Here's how I got these scars." Writing workshops would probably say that's an example of telling, not showing, but it still works and it still comes off great in those movies. Really, what show don't tell means is the same thing that most writing advice boils down to. Try to write good things. Don't try to write bad things. Which, thanks, man. Really helpful. Glad I shelled out for that masterclass. The thing about writing for films, novels, short stories, SNL, daytime TV, whatever, is that we can't come up with clear rules. Instead, having to rely mostly on just recognizing good and bad examples and pointing them out. So yeah, that's basically just a long preamble to say that I'm going to use the same flawed metric of show, don't tell, to talk about The Conjuring. All of the based on a true story, look at the Warren spooky room of D&D miniatures, is a great example of telling instead of showing. We don't see how the Warrens put all that stuff in the creepy room, or even the other ghosts they've investigated. Instead, it's just the blaring siren towards the beginning of the movie that yells, "This really happened, you guys!" And it doesn't work to ground the movie at all. I know there are people who think that the events in The Conjuring really happened, but the movie wisely runs away from any sort of gritty or handheld aesthetic to try to make it seem realistic, instead preferring to make a clean, stylish movie with some eye-popping scares. But what really grounds a movie in reality? What actually makes a story about a ghost or a demon oh so real? Well, to answer that question, we have to look at The Conjuring's granddaddy. The Exorcist came out in 1973, and after its box office earnings are adjusted for inflation, the movie made almost $1 billion. Considered one of the best haunting movies ever made, the movie is famous for some pretty graphic scenes, from the possessed little girl's head twisting a full 360 degrees to the spider walk down the stairs. But what gets overlooked about The Exorcist is the first hour or so of the movie does what all of The Conjuring's screaming based on a true story's bluster couldn't. It grounds the movie in reality. Famously, The Exorcist made members of the audience puke or faint during its screening. But it's not the buckets of vomit that were too much for people. No, it was the intense depiction of 1970s medical procedures drawing blood and doing an MRI of poor Regan towards the beginning of the movie that made people sick. You see, The Exorcist is smart, in that little Regan doesn't go from adorable little angel to screaming monster overnight, before memorably shouting,
"Your mother sucks cocks in hell, Paris, you faithless swine."
Regan exhibits a bunch of behavior that could be tied to various physical or psychological problems. The first hour is a ringer of doctors and medical tests, none being able to figure out what is happening to Regan. The story is from the point of view of Regan's parents, who are driven to the Catholic Church to perform the exorcism as a literal last resort, once doctors basically tell them, "We don't know what's wrong with your daughter." For anyone that has ever had themselves or a loved one have a mystery ailment that doctors couldn't explain, Regan's plight hits really close to home. You feel the desperation, the sense of wrongness, when a person you used to know has something seriously wrong with them, and no one can tell you or them what it is. That horror is real, something to connect with, that then transfers easily when the possession of Regan starts to become more outlandish. By the end, The Exorcist is no longer just a movie about a mystery medical condition, but that first hour is key for us to connect to Regan's family and the real pain they are experiencing due to her condition. That conflict and pain grounds us in reality, so we are riveted and terrified by the finale of the film even to this day. The Exorcist does a great job at feeling more real than The Conjuring ever could. And since The Exorcist, no film's really gotten the formula right. Paranormal Activity and other found footage movies were always a bit too reliant on gimmicks, and The Conjuring-style chillers succeed in spite of their overblown framing. Well, almost no film. In 2018, a first-time filmmaker got the balance just right. Part 2. Vulnerability and Pain. Horror movies are distinctly emotional experiences. If you have an audience trying to logic a horror movie, you just end up with Scream. Which is fine, but it's been done, and it wasn't all that brilliant. The best horror movies are immune to logic or reason because they sweep you up in a nightmare, where the rules are arbitrary and never let you find your balance again. That's why when trying to ground a haunting, you have to start at an emotional level. And when dealing with horror, what better emotion to use than pain? Relationships with other people are quite literally one of the only reasons to exist on this swirling blue ball and give yourself meaning. But with every relationship, there is some sort of pain buried within. Whether it's something that you and your friend, partner, or family member can work through in a healthy way, or something you can't, to be human is to experience at some point in your life pain caused by other people. And Hereditary is just drenched in it. From Annie's painful relationship with her mother to Peter's pain-filled relationship with Annie, the movie just pulses with anguish from the very beginning. But it's not from an external ghostly source. No, the pain is coming from each member of the family. The strained relationship is most apparent between Annie and Peter, who from their first interaction, it's clear that their connection hangs by a slim thread. Toni Collette, who plays Annie, her monologue in the beginning of the movie about how she feels as a mother is a great window into a set of relatable feelings I know a lot of us have. We understand why she feels blamed, why she feels unsure about her mother's death. Nothing supernatural is even at work yet, and we know something in this family is fundamentally broken. And then, well, the worst happens. Because of the grounding, we have with this family. After Charlie dies, we know there's no going back. The pain is no longer pulsing under the surface between Annie and her son. Instead, it's out in the open and devastating to their relationship. While the descent into a very real hell is not something that most of us experience, nor is being manipulated by a demonic cult to bring the king of hell to earth a relatable experience, well, at least I'd hope not, we all have seen family relationships that are strained or sometimes broken apart altogether. The stakes of what's happening between Peter and Annie feel real because they are grounded in emotions that we can recognize. A frightening moment is when Peter comes home riding a bike and Annie is just out there, in the car, waiting for him. Peter's staring at the car like his own mother is a ghostly apparition, not a beloved member of his family. Like she is the monster he needs to run from. And for all intents and purposes, he's right. I've always contended that the most terrifying moments of Hereditary are not the shocking scene with Charlie or the bananas finale, but instead the moments where Annie is dreaming. Her sleepwalking sequences give us the tortured feeling she has towards her son after the accident, and it feels so damn real. Of particular note is the scene where she tells Peter how she feels.
I never wanted to be your mother.
The acting is incredible as Toni Collette grasps at the air around her, desperate to cram her words back into her mouth, to unsay the thing that will forever sever her relationship with her son. And those are stakes we, the audience, can understand. Hereditary is great because it plays at being a convoluted psychological horror film, but at the end just wants to terrify you much like The Exorcist. The difference is in the endings of the two films. In The Exorcist, Pazuzu is defeated, thrown out of Regan's body through sacrifice and the efforts of the priests. Regan is undoubtedly scarred by the experience, but she gets to go back to her parents, and her possession little more than a bad memory. In Hereditary, that's not what happens.
Hail Payman! Hail Payman!
Grounded in the pain of its main characters, Hereditary does not let Peter or Annie escape. Worse, by the finale, it implies there was never any escape to begin with, that they had no control over the plan they were placed in the center of, and had as little agency as the diorama houses and people Annie paints in the attic. Hereditary and The Exorcist are grounded because their writers and directors anchor their ghostly tales in real human emotions. Without a strong emotional core to latch onto, ghost movies lose most of their dread, and instead turn into fun but thin haunted house attractions, like Insidious or The Conjuring. In 20 years, I don't know if people remember The Conjuring as the genre-defining movie it is today, in the same breath as The Exorcist and Hereditary, because it doesn't matter how many times you remind the audience the story is based on true events in the credits. You gotta do more than just tell an audience that ghosts are real. You have to make them feel the dread waiting at the end of a long hallway, and once they feel it, they might just start to believe.